Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and get started, and if more people trickle in along the way, uh, then they'll just enter the room. But good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Shjarback. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Law and Justice Studies at Rowan University, and I'd like to thank the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center for funding this project, which is titled "A Spatial Examination of Gun Violence in New Jersey." This is very much a work in progress, and I've been hit with some data limitations along the way. So not much has been done in the way of a true spatial examination due to some of those data limitations and challenges, which I'll get into. Which, if anybody has some recommendations, I'm more than willing to hear. So this project is ultimately about interpersonal gun violence throughout the state of New Jersey. And from what we do know, largely mirroring patterns found throughout the rest of the country, gun violence, interpersonal transactional gun violence, when it comes to homicide, is not evenly distributed throughout space or among different racial or ethnic groups, across gender or age. And using some indicators from the New Jersey State Health Assessment Data, or the SHAD, for 5 years from 2016 through 2020, there were a reported 1,100 firearm homicide deaths that occurred throughout the entire state. And you could see the geographic concentration when it comes to different municipalities throughout the state. Although there are 500 plus municipalities, 8 cities accounted for a little over 60% of all firearm homicide deaths over that 5-year period. And those 8 cities include Atlantic City, Camden, East Orange, Irvington, Newark, Jersey City, Trenton, and Paterson. When it comes to the racial and ethnic demographics of firearm homicide deaths, 76.7% of all those killed by firearm homicide were Black, and 15% were Hispanic. So tremendous overrepresentation here when it comes to Black and Hispanic New Jerseyans dying by gun homicide over that 5-year period. When it comes to males, no surprise here, but 87.8% of those who are killed by firearm homicide are male. And then when you look at the age distribution here, a little over 70% of those killed by firearm homicide are between the ages of 15 and 34. So it is relatively concentrated within a few municipalities. Black and Hispanic New Jerseyans are overrepresented, as well as males and young males at that. Moving a step further and looking at juveniles, so anybody under the age of 18 killed by firearm homicide, those same indicators from the New Jersey SHAD data for 2016 through the end of 2020 show that there were 56 juveniles who were killed by firearm homicide. 80% or 45 out of the 56 were Black. Another 10 or 18% were Hispanic, so that collectively is 98%. One juvenile who was killed by firearm homicide was Asian, and none were white. So perhaps even more startling of the disproportionality, the overrepresentation here among Black and Hispanic New Jerseyans in terms of juveniles who die by firearm homicide in any given year. So with that as a base, as a foundation, my aim through this small grant from the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center was to move beyond firearm homicides and to also include all those incidents where people are shot, they're struck by gunfire, but they don't die. So non-fatal injurious shootings, or what the New Jersey State Police call hits. And I also aimed to move beyond just the city or the municipality as the unit of analysis. And I wanted to examine the distribution of transactional gun violence across census tracts, which I thought was a more manageable unit of analysis that that more closely adhered to what we can consider a neighborhood. And when we use larger units of analysis like the city or the municipality, we run into the ecological fallacy, the idea that there is more opportunity to conceal variation across space that's less visible at larger units of analysis. And we certainly run into that when we use states as the unit of analysis when we're exploring gun violence or any other outcome that we're setting out to examine. So the goal through all of this was to be able to map rates of both fatal and non-fatal injurious shootings across census tracts, and kind of engage in that spatial analysis, map it out with the idea of answering some of these research questions. Are shootings in New Jersey more concentrated at the census tract level compared to just the city or municipality? And from what we know, they are extremely concentrated at that city or municipality unit of analysis. And then bring in some census level indicators at the census tract level and examine what are the census tract level characteristics that are most associated with gun violence. And here the plan was to, examine economic disadvantage and residential segregation, due to the fact that those are some of the neighborhood level variables that consistently predict interpersonal gun violence. So in terms of a data plan, I OPRA'd, or Open Public Records Act, requested 3 years worth of data from the New Jersey State Police's Regional Operations and Intelligence Center, or the ROC. I asked for all fatal as well as non-fatal hits throughout the entire state over that 3-year period of 2019, 2020, and 2021. I was specifically interested in the date and the time of those shootings, what the demographics of the shooting victims were when it comes to race and ethnicity, age, and gender, and whether or not the shooting victim ended up dying versus survived the gunshot wound. And perhaps most importantly to the overall goal of the project was I asked for some type of location data for each of the shootings, whether it be X or Y coordinates, de-identified addresses, and I guess I wished for something that was not necessarily possible, which I'll get into a second, but using either the X or Y coordinate or a de-identified address, you could plug that information into the U.S. Census Bureau's geocoder tool, and it'll tell you the exact census tract, the census block group. It's a pretty interesting tool for finding out exactly where something is in relation to the U.S. Census. But here is where I started to run into some challenges. I received most of those items on my wish list, except for the location information. So currently, I only have the city, the municipality where that shooting occurred. I've been trying to contact people at the New Jersey State Police's ROC Center. I've worked with the Gun Violence Research Center and tried to tap some of their resources that they've used in the past. And what I've received in return is that any more precise location information, like those X and Y coordinates, like a de-identified address, 500 block of First Street, was law enforcement sensitive, and I would be unable to obtain that level of information. I tried negotiating with them, and they promised that they would provide the zip codes for where each shooting occurred. I haven't yet received those, but that is not going to be much of a help, considering the fact that a lot of municipalities throughout the state only have a single zip code for most municipalities, even the largest, both geographically and population-wise, in places like Newark, only have a few different zip codes. So it won't provide me the unit of analysis to truly explore things at the neighborhood level. However, I attended the summit last Friday and I'm still trying to actively obtain information to find the census tracts from the Rock Center. I haven't given up hope yet, and hopefully I could lean on some of the contacts and the networking that I've made along the way to get that. So this has been pretty hectic, a little frustrating, and I've tried to find different ways to work around um, not having the more precise location information. One colleague of mine, Dan Semenza, actually recommended checking out the gun violence archive and seeing if I could find, X and Y coordinates, a street address, what have you, on shootings from the gun violence archive. So I tried that, and the goal was to match the data that I do have, since I have date, time, the demographics of the shooting victim, the city where it occurred in, and then trying to search the gun violence archive for each individual shooting. And it's certainly possible to do that. For example, I have one here, which is a data point in my data from the Rock Center, that of a fatal shooting that occurred in Atlantic City, where here I have the intersection of where the shooting occurred, as well as the X and Y coordinates. So it is helpful for certain cases. However, the presence of a data point being located in the gun violence archive is contingent upon media coverage. So if there is no media coverage, no story on television or in a media outlet, then it won't be located in the gun violence archive. And what I found when trying to go through and troubleshooting is that these mostly non-fatal shootings are underreported. So it leaves me back at square one, where I could potentially do this for all fatal shootings, but I wanted to explore more than just the fatals. I wanted to look at the non-fatal injurious hits. So I have a few options here. Ideally, is to get the more precise location information from the Rock. Um, I could use the gun violence archive approach and map all of the available locations of shootings that are present in the gun violence archive, and then try to arrive at the census tract where each shooting occurred. But again, that's just going to be mostly fatals that have received some type of media coverage and hence presence in the gun violence archive. Or I could go department by department and try to reach out, or even OPRA, Open Public Records Act, um, the shooting data for the location for some of these cities that have the highest propensity for gun violence. So these are my options, which I'm weighing. But I before I finish, I did want to give everybody a quick snapshot of the data that I do have. And again, it's pretty rich in that it has every fatal and non-fatal, but injurious shooting throughout the entire state for a 3-year period. So there were a total of 3,723 shooting victims. And as you can see here, only about 17% of those struck by gunfire throughout the entire state died as a result of being shot. Um, Close to 83% survived their gunshot wounds, which goes into that idea of an iceberg. When we're studying gun violence, there is a lot of research that tends to focus on fatalities where people do die, but missing in a lot of research is everything below the surface that doesn't necessarily include fatalities. So here in these data, you can see that the vast majority, more than 3/4 of everybody struck by gunfire, does survive, and is located in the data. In terms of race or ethnicity, 77.8% of the shooting victims were Black, 12.1% were Hispanic. White non-Hispanics made up a little over 3%, Asian and Pacific Islander 0.3%, and there was a non-trivial portion of shooting victims where the race or ethnicity was unknown. In terms of gender, you can see the breakdown here. Largely male, 86%. The average age of a shooting victim was 30, or 30 and a half, with a standard deviation of 14. And something that I wanted to make note of was that 8% of all shooting victims, or 299 people, were under the age of 18, so juveniles who were struck by gunfire. And then just a quick breakdown of um, the number of shooting victims by year. You can see in 2019 there were a little over 1,000 shooting victims. 2020 we saw nationally an increase in gun violence, and that was borne out in New Jersey as well, where you see close to 300 additional shooting victims in 2020, which increased again in 2021 with 1,412 shooting victims. I wanted to kind of mirror that municipality representation from the fatals, and I took those same 8 municipalities, and it turns out that they accounted for a little less than 3/4, 73.7% of all shooting victims, which is higher than the 61% of firearm homicide victims from 2006 through the end of 2020 from the New Jersey SHAD data. And you can see the breakdown here of those 8 municipalities. Newark, which is the state's largest city with a little over 300,000 people, 1 out of every 4 people who is shot throughout the state is shot in the city of Newark, followed by Patterson, where that city accounts for 12% of all shooting victims, Trenton 10, Camden 10, Jersey City a little over 7%, Atlantic City 4, Irvington, and East Orange. And then 6 additional municipalities account for another 10% of all shooting victims over that 3-year period. And you can see the breakdown there: Elizabeth, New Brunswick, Salem City, Asbury Park, Millville, and Plainfield. So if you're keeping track, that is 14 municipalities that account for 84.4% of all shooting victims. And important to keep in mind that there are 564 municipalities throughout the state. So you could see how concentrated it is from a municipality unit of analysis. I want to go beyond that, but currently being prohibited due to some of those data limitations. The ultimate goal of this research is to track and identify the neighborhoods, in other words, the census tracts with the highest risk of gun violence through a geospatial analysis. And once that is done, and once potentially, hopefully, a database is constructed, it can be used by anybody, really, law enforcement, community organizations, to leverage community and school-based resources once those census tracts are identified, and could hopefully inform funding decisions. For example, if there is limited money out there, perhaps we could direct that limited money in terms of funding to keeping certain recreation centers open in those census tracts that have the highest propensity for gun violence. Perhaps we could keep after school programs open longer in those census tracts that have the highest propensity for gun violence. So that is what I would like to see, provided that I could access the data and conduct what I set out to accomplish when this RFP was first announced early in 2023. So that's all I have for you guys. I appreciate your time for listening. Here's my contact information, and I'm eager to hear any recommendations you might have for those data limitations, and any questions that you might have for me. Okay. Okay, so I have a few comments from Frank. Hi, Frank. Um, all that information was likely in a news article at the time of the shooting. I'm guessing New Jersey won't be doing a shooting map like the Philadelphia Controller's Office does. Um, I wish sometimes that the state had, the data portal, the open data that is provided by cities like Philadelphia and Chicago, where really accurate point data, X and Y coordinates are provided for each shooting victim. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I sure wish it was. Um, And then another question from Frank. Are the municipalities like Newark doing this type of identification at the local level to identify hotspots? So I went to the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center's summit last Friday in New Brunswick. And I actually got a chance to talk to people who work for the Newark Public Safety Collaborative. And they have an MOU and MOA with the Newark Police Department that provides them with spatial data for things like shootings, precise spatial data. However, it does not provide the demographics of like shooting victims. So I've been in touch with the Newark Public Safety Collaborative. They're going to make me like a heat map, a density map to show the locations of where shootings are more likely to occur. But it won't have any of the demographics of the shooting victims. So whereas I have that information, but I lack the location information, they have the location information, but lack the demographics of the shooting victims. So yeah, difficult to do. And I appreciate the kind words from James Stewart, Arlana Henry. Um, okay, well, if there's no other questions, I thank you all for your time, and you know, I'll put my email address in the chat again if anybody wants to reach out. But thank you again. I really appreciate it.